Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my July wrap up. Today I'm going to be talking about all the things that I read in the month of July. So in July I read 15.5 books. 2 of those were unpublished books that I read for work, so I can't talk about them. And then 8 books of those 15 were books that I read for Jane Austen July, which was a readathon I was hosting throughout the month of July along with Marissa from Blatantly Bookish. I'll link her channel down below. And then 5 of them were random non-Jane Austen related books. So one thing I did not read this month was any books by Anthony Trollope. This year, as a lot of you will know, I have been doing what I've called the Trollope Project, where I've been reading a book by Anthony Trollope every month. I failed to do that in July, partly because I was on holiday for a lot of July and all the Trollope books I've been reading have been from the library, and I didn't really want to take a library book away with me on holiday, and partly because I was busy with Jane Austen related reading. So I think what I'm just going to do is carry on for the rest of the year, and then in October, which is Victober or Victorian October for me, another readathon that I am hosting, I think I will read 2 Anthony Trollope books in that month because I'll be reading all Victorian literature anyway, and then the rest of the year I'll just read 1 a month as well. So I will start off with the books that I read for Jane Austen July before getting on to the random other bits and pieces that I read. So there were 7 different challenges which we set for Jane Austen July. The first one was to read 1 of Jane Austen's novels. I read 4 of Jane Austen's novels, as you do. I reread Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and Mansfield Park. 4 very amazing novels, and so I will go through all of them in turn. I will start off with Northanger Abbey because that is my least favourite. So previously I have usually said that this is my second least favourite Jane Austen, but I think this time rereading it, it became my least favourite, partly because Sense and Sensibility, which I'll talk about in a minute, became my second least favourite instead and kind of grew a little bit in my estimation. I do really like Northanger Abbey, and I think it's quite a nice place to start with Jane Austen because it's a bit simpler plot-wise, but I think one of the reasons why it's not my favourite is because it's a little bit simpler plot-wise. It follows a young woman called Catherine Morland. She's 17 years old, she is very imaginative and really likes reading books, especially Gothic fiction, and at the beginning of the book she is invited by some family friends to spend some time with them in Bath, where she meets various people and we follow her kind of adventures. I really enjoy Northanger Abbey. I think it's very funny in terms of the actual prose and the writing, and Jane Austen kind of parodies Gothic fiction in quite a fun way, but I don't think I love the characters in it quite as much as some other Jane Austen books. I then also reread Sense and Sensibility. Now Sense and Sensibility I have previously usually said is my least favourite Jane Austen, but actually I really enjoyed it on this reread. I listened to it on audiobook. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Rosamund Pike, which is on Audible and which I would highly recommend. She also has a great audiobook of Pride and Prejudice, and this was just a really fun, enjoyable read. Sense and Sensibility follows 2 siblings, Marianne and Eleanor. Eleanor is very sensible, Marianne is very emotional and passionate, and after the death of their father, they with their mother and younger sister are forced to leave the family home they've grown up in and move elsewhere, and we follow the kind of romantic relationships of both Eleanor and Marianne as well as their relationship as siblings. There was a lot that I enjoyed about Sense and Sensibility this time. I have always found it an odd Jane Austen because I love the story, but I find the pacing a bit off, and the certain character relationships, particularly the kind of Edward-Eleanor dynamic, which I don't feel are like as completely developed as I would like them to be. And also the younger sister Margaret is not very developed either. And so I find the pacing in the whole of the book a bit off. But there are also a lot of things that I love about it, and I really like the kind of exploration of sibling relationships and of kind of changing family circumstances, and some of the minor characters are truly excellent. I talked about this a little bit more in my reading vlog that I made for like the last 10 days of Jane Austen July, and I also talked about it a bit more in a like book to screen review that I made of the 2008 miniseries of this, which we'll talk about a bit more in a minute. So yeah, Sense and Sensibility is still not my favourite Jane Austen, and I do think the pacing's a bit weird, but I liked it a lot more this time, so that's interesting. Another one I reread on audiobook was Mansfield Park. I have a great audiobook of this narrated by Frances Barber. It's such a good audiobook, such a good novel. I think it's fantastic. It follows the character of Fanny Price, who is from a sort of relatively poor background. She's sort of from a lower middle class background, and she is sent to live with her cousins and aunt and uncle who are in the upper class. And growing up with them, she has a very different life from her siblings back at home, but while she is growing up in this place of privilege, she is treated as beneath the rest of the family and kind of has a weird social position where she's sort of neither really truly part of the family, but she's also not a servant. And the book follows her kind of growing up, her friendship with her cousin Edmund, and what happens when 2 new young people move into the neighbourhood who are very, very different from everyone around them. I love Mansfield Park a lot. I think it is a truly brilliant novel. Like, Pride and Prejudice is my favourite Jane Austen, but I think Mansfield Park might be the best Jane Austen, and I love it nearly as much as Pride and Prejudice. Like, this has such a strong hold on my heart, this book. I love it so much. Fanny Price is a fantastic character. She is quiet and unassuming and meek at times, and doesn't speak very much in conversation. She keeps herself to herself, but she is incredibly like emotionally strong and very much sticks to her guns and stands up for herself when she needs to, which is something I really, really like about her. I think a lot of people find Fanny Price a slightly less interesting character than more witty vocal characters like Lizzie Bennet, but I actually think Fanny Price is the most interesting heroine in Jane Austen. And this book is, the plotting is so interesting, the characterisation is so rich, the Crawfords are such an interesting pair, and everyone around them is so interesting. I love Mansfield Park a lot. It's also a book about like home and class and belonging, which I really, really like too. Another thing I will say, this was my, I don't know, 5th rereading, maybe 6th rereading of Mansfield Park, and I would say that I liked the character of Edmund Bertram a lot more this time. I sometimes find Edmund a bit boring and not that interesting, but actually on this rereading I really, really liked him. I liked him a lot more than previously, so that's interesting too. A great one to reread. And I then also reread Pride and Prejudice, again on audiobook. I did lots of Jane Austen listening this month. I listened to the audiobook narrated by Rosamund Pike, which is fantastic. This is the 3rd time I've listened to it in the last 18 months, so that tells you quite a lot. I think that Pride and Prejudice is a wonderful, brilliant novel, one of the best novels ever written. It is funny and witty and touching and clever and insightful. It follows the Bennet family, 2 parents and their 5 daughters. The estate that Mr. Bennet owns is entailed on the male line, so his daughters won't inherit any money or any property, so if they want to have a life where they can look after themselves, at least one of them has to marry well. And we follow particularly the 2 eldest sisters, Elizabeth and Jane, and their romantic relationships and their relationship with each other as sisters. There are so many things that I love about Pride and Prejudice. The character development in this is one of the things that I think is the most impressive, especially when you read like other books from the same time as Jane Austen was writing, and you see how little character development there is there, and how much people are more sort of set in their ways as characters and don't change. The way that Jane Austen is able to write about characters changing and how people change over time is fantastic. I also think just like the character relationships and dynamics are so good, the dialogue is so witty, the writing is so fresh and lovely. Like, there's just so much in Pride and Prejudice that I love and that makes me smile and makes me happy, and yeah, it was fantastic to reread it once again. I think Pride and Prejudice is probably now my most reread book, and I think this was probably about the 10th time I read it. Then the second challenge for Jane Austen in July was to read something by Jane Austen which was not one of her main 6 books, so juvenilia or shorter works or letters. So I read quite a bit of Jane Austen's juvenilia this month. I read this little penguin black classic, The Beautiful Cassandra, which contains a few of her different pieces of juvenilia, including my favourite work of Jane Austen's juvenilia, Jack and Alice, which is just absolutely hilarious. I would highly recommend Jane Austen's juvenilia if you haven't read any of it. It is full of like drunkenness and violence and things that you don't necessarily expect from a Jane Austen book, which is quite fun. Like the main character in Jack and Alice, Alice is like drunk all the time. It's just really funny. So yeah, I would highly recommend Jane Austen's juvenilia. It's really good fun and a bit silly, but in the best way. And then I also read some other of her juvenilia from this book. The reason why I said I read 15 and a half books in the month of July because I didn't read this cover to cover, though I have many times before. I just like picked and chose a few different bits of juvenilia in here just to read a bit more of it because I really love it. So yeah, it was really fun. Another of the challenges for Jane Austen July was to read a non-fiction book about Jane Austen or her time, and for this I read this. This is Eavesdropping on Jane Austen's England by Roy and Leslie Adkins. This is a non-fiction history book about the late 18th and early 19th century. I really enjoyed this. It is very, very readable. I actually read this on holiday on the beach in like 2 days, which is not what you necessarily expect from a non-fiction book, which I think tells you how accessible and readable this is. It is mostly a social and cultural history, which is the kind of history that I like, and talks a lot about like manners and behaviour and marriage and various things like that. It also uses a lot of primary sources and quotes from a lot of primary sources, which is something I especially like in history books. So this is a really good non-fiction book, really interesting if you want to learn more about the time Jane Austen was living in, and I would highly recommend it. Then another of the challenges was to read a book by a contemporary of Jane Austen, someone else who was writing at Jane Austen's time. So for this I read Marriage by Susan Ferrier. This follows a woman called Lady Juliana who gets married at the beginning of the book to a man that she likes but doesn't have as much money as she thinks he has, and she has had a very privileged upbringing and suddenly finds that she cares more about money than she does about people, and she doesn't really like her husband. So we follow sort of her and her marriage, and then further down the line we follow her daughter Mary, who has grown up away from Lady Juliana, is a much nicer person than Lady Juliana, and we kind of see a conflict between them in terms of their personalities, Mary being very sweet and kind and nice, and Juliana being a horrible person. There were some things about marriage that I liked. I found it very interesting, and in the second half of the book I got into it much more. I found the kind of Mary-Juliana dynamic quite interesting, especially because it's quite similar to the dynamic in Lady Susan between Lady Susan and her daughter, and also in The Widow Barnaby by Frances Trollope, which I read last month. It's quite similar to the dynamic in that between The Widow Barnaby and her niece, and I wonder if that, like, horrible older generation, sweet to younger woman who's related to her and has to put up with this awful woman but is actually much nicer. I feel like maybe that's like a late 18th, early 19th century trope, because I've spotted it in quite a few things, so that's quite interesting. So like I said, I found some things about marriage interesting, but I didn't love it. I found the writing a bit boring, and I found the characterisation a bit flat. And in general, whenever I read something from the late 18th or early 19th century, my main reaction is, it's just not as good as Jane Austen. The characterisation, especially in all books I have read from the 18th century and from like the first 20 years of the 19th century, bar Jane Austen, I find the characterisation incredibly flat. And when I compare it to Jane Austen's characterisation, which is so rich, I'm just even more amazed by how amazing Jane Austen is and how much her writing was ahead of her time. So there we go. Another challenge for Jane Austen July was to read a retelling of a Jane Austen novel, and for this I read Unequal Affections by Lara Ormiston. To explain the premise, I need to have a midpoint spoiler for Pride and Prejudice, so if you haven't read Pride and Prejudice and somehow don't know anything about it, I will put a little warning on the screen. So this follows an alternate version of Pride and Prejudice where when Darcy proposes to Elizabeth, she doesn't say no, she says, let me have a week to think about it, because she is so surprised by his proposal that she suddenly realises she doesn't know him very well, and so she starts to kind of reconsider, and then a week later accepts him. And the book follows the course of like their engagement and kind of getting to know each other. I did really like it, and I think it was really interesting, especially as like a character study. Like it's not a novel that works on its own. It is not just a retelling of Pride and Prejudice in the way that like Longbourn is, where you could read Longbourn and it functions really well on its own. It's almost like a creative analysis and interpretation of Pride and Prejudice and its characters. Like it really is a character study in such an interesting way, and the way it examines like Elizabeth and Darcy as people, and the way it uses certain lines of dialogue from Pride and Prejudice in different situations is really, really clever. Like there's so much in this book that I really love and that I thought was fantastic, and that means I would highly, highly recommend it. There were one or two things that I was like, do I fully believe that Elizabeth Bennet would behave in this way? But then actually, the more I think about it, the more I kind of do. So yeah, I would really highly recommend this. I think it's a really strong and really interesting novel, and it will also like make you rethink the way you interpret certain things in Pride and Prejudice as well. There were also 2 screen adaptations for Jane Austen July. The first was to watch a direct screen adaptation of a Jane Austen book, and for that I read Sense and Sensibility. This is the 2008 adaptation, which is amazing. It is my favourite adaptation of a Jane Austen novel. It is absolutely brilliant. I did a full like book to screen review of this, so I'll link that down below. I'm going to talk about it much here. But suffice to say, this is beautifully acted, wonderfully shot. I think this fixes a lot of the pacing issues that Sense and Sensibility has as a story, and it's just amazing. And then for the challenge of watching a modern screen retelling or adaptation of a Jane Austen book, I have been watching From Mansfield with Love, which is a mini web series on YouTube. I haven't actually finished it. I'm like 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through now, but I'm canning it for this challenge because I watched a lot of it in July, and I am really, really enjoying it. It took me a little bit of time to get into it, but since I have warmed up to it properly, I've got properly into it. I really like how they've done Fanny Price in a modern way that is quite different, but also is, I think, true to her character. And like the people who play the Crawfords and the Bertrams are quite good as well. I would say that like in comparison to the Lizzie Bennet Diaries or Emma Approved, the production quality is not quite as high, but it is still really good, and I really like how they've interpreted a lot of elements of the story and kind of moved them into the modern age. Then on to the 5 non-Jane Austen related books that I read in July. So last year in Jane Austen July I only read Jane Austen related things, but this year I decided not to, partly because I was going on holiday and quite a lot of the stuff I wanted to read was like hardback or nice editions that I didn't want to take on holiday with me, and I thought it would be nice to read a few other different bits and pieces while I was on holiday. So one book I read was this. This is Tokyo UNO Station by Yu Muri. To be honest, I didn't get that much out of this. It follows a man who is sort of a ghost, and he is haunting a place that he used to live, which is effectively like a homeless village, really, in the park near a station in Tokyo. And he is kind of looking back on the course of his life and its connection to the history of Tokyo. I would say I found the writing in this too literary and too inaccessible for me. There were some really powerful moments, especially when the main character looks back on the death of his son. I thought those moments were incredibly powerful. For the most part, I just found this a little bit confusing and got a little bit lost, so I wouldn't hugely recommend this. An interesting read nonetheless, and I have been trying to read a Japanese book every month this year, so that's cool. I then also read An Artist of the Floating World by Kazu Ishiguro, which I really, really loved. I love Ishiguro's writing a lot. I've now only got one of his books left to read, which is The Unconsoled. I think he's such a fantastic writer. There's only been one of his books, The Buried Giant, which I didn't especially love, but in general I think his writing is so powerful. This is the kind of literary fiction I like, where it's thematically driven and really complex, but the writing is understandable and accessible. This follows a man in Japan shortly after the Second World War, looking back on his time in the Second World War and his relationship with the Second World War, especially any role he might have played as an artist in sort of creating propaganda. And it's about kind of people in Japan after the Second World War reinterpreting the Second World War as an event and reinterpreting the way Japan acted in the Second World War and the way certain individuals acted. Like so many of Ishiguro's books, it examines the theme of memory. Like, actually, I think every single Ishiguro book I've read examines memory as its central theme, which is something I absolutely love because it's one of my favourite themes. Like, I love a looking back narrative and a looking back book, and I love a book in which characters are looking back on the past and reinterpreting the past as they do. And there is so much in this book that I think is fantastic in the way our main character examines the past and looks back on his life and what his actions were and whether or not he ought to be proud or ashamed of his past. It's such a fantastic novel and one that I really would recommend. Yeah, I liked it a lot. I really like Ishiguro. Once I have finally read The Unconsoled, I think I'll make an author spotlight on him because I love his work a lot. I then also read The Clockmakers Daughter by Kate Morton, which I really enjoyed. I haven't read a Kate Morton for years, but when I was a teenager, she was one of my absolute favourite authors, so it was really nice to read some more of her. The Clockmaker's Daughter is, like many of her books, a book that kind of spans a lot of different time periods. So in the present day, we are following a woman called Elodie. She's an archivist, and in her work, she stumbles across this sketchbook, which contains a sketch of a house that when she sees it, she thinks, I know this house, I've heard about this house, someone has described this house to me before. And she ends up kind of trying to work out where in her family's history this house might have a connection to her family. And then we also skip back into the past, into the Victorian period and onwards, where we follow a woman who visited this house, who is now sort of a ghostly presence in the house, I suppose. It's more like a sort of metaphorical speculative element, if that makes sense. And we follow her sort of looking back on her time in the 19th century in this house, and then we follow various people who lived in this house over the sort of late 19th and 20th centuries, following the like little stories and vignettes of these various people who lived in this house. I love books that look at like a grand house and all the people who have lived in them. That's just something I find really, really interesting. And I think Kate Morton does sort of historical fiction and historical elements and lots of different characters very, very well. She's very good at characterization and making you get to character quite quickly and in quite a short space of time. So yeah, I would highly recommend this. I think it's really, really good. A really, really interesting and fun novel, and yeah, I really enjoyed it. It's quite long, so it's actually quite nice to read on holiday and like properly get your teeth into, and I'm so glad I finally picked up another Kate Morton because I do really enjoy her work. Then also, while we were on holiday, Nick and I listened to 2 audiobooks together. One we listened to was Man Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. I have never actually read any P.G. Wodehouse before, but this was so fun. This is a short story collection with various stories in, some of which are about Jeeves and Worcester, those very famous pair of master and manservant, where the master is not very clever and the manservant is all of the brains behind the operation, which is very, very funny. I'm kind of familiar with these characters from popular culture, but it was really nice to actually read about them and discover them. And then the other half of the collection are stories following different characters, and most of them about a man called Reggie Pepper, who's a bit like Bertie Wooster in terms of not being very intelligent and getting into lots of different scrapes. I really, really enjoyed these. They're very, very funny. And I also just loved the weird, insane interwar British slang. Like, British slang in the interwar period for the upper classes was just mad. Like, it's just really silly, and I just really enjoyed that and the use of it in the writing style. So yeah, I really enjoyed my Man Jeeves, and hopefully Nick and I will listen to some more Jeeves and Wooster on audiobook in the future. And then the other thing we listened to was Murder on the Links by Agatha Christie, which is the second Poirot novel. We listened to the first Poirot novel, Mysterious Affair at Styles, last year, and our plan is to like go through all of Poirot on audiobook at some point. So Murder on the Links is set in France. A millionaire is murdered, but like 2 days before he's murdered, he sends a letter to Poirot saying, "I think my life is in danger, will you come and help me?" And so Poirot comes to this man's rescue, but when he gets there, the man is already dead. And we kind of follow Poirot and Hastings solving this murder. But also there is a French detective who turns up on the scene to also try and solve the murder, called Giraud. And Giraud is really like Sherlock Holmes. Like, I'm assuming this is on purpose and that it is a joke about Sherlock Holmes, but Giraud is like very detail focused like Sherlock Holmes, and likes really small details, and likes to like examine cigarette ash and therefore work out where the smoker who must be the murderer was therefore. And like at one point Giraud like disguises himself as a bush and is like lying on the floor looking at clues in a very Sherlock Holmes-esque way, and Poirot's like really dismissive of him and is like, I think at one point Poirot says something like, "A clue that is 2 foot long is just as important as a clue that is 2 inches long." And so there's quite a lot of like funny taking the mick out of Sherlock Holmes style detectiving while proving that Poirot is the superior detective, which I just found really hilarious. Hastings, as always, is very silly in this book. Like, I do get quite frustrated with just how stupid Hastings is sometimes, but in a very like funny and entertaining way, and I do think he means well, and I quite liked his plot arc in this book too. So yeah, it was a good mystery, full of twists and turns, as I always expect from Poirot, and really good fun. So yes, those are all the things that I read in the month of July. Do let me know down in the comments what you read in July. Did you take part in Jane Austen July? Did you enjoy it? What did you read? And yeah, that's all for today, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.